Well, hello from the line. Thank you for joining us for this timely discussion. The pandemic should have brought the US and China closer together for greater cooperation, but instead, it's accelerated tensions with bilateral relations sinking to their lowest and looking more and more irreversible. That in turn is changing the dynamics of the international system, with Indo-Pacific economies finding themselves caught in the middle. Navigating between the US and China is becoming increasingly difficult. So, can middle powers like India, Indonesia, Korea, and Singapore band together, shape, and influence Chinese or American behavior? Or are they destined to be pawns in a game of power? I'm really excited to introduce to you our distinguished speakers today. Ambassador Heng Chee is Asia Society co-chair. Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar, Research Center for Politics, Indonesian Institute of Sciences. Shivshankar Menon is former Foreign Secretary of India. And Dr. June Park, East Asia Voices Initiative Fellow at the East Asian National Resource Center, Elliott School of International Affairs, the George Washington University. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Now, Shiv, you're the only thorn among the roses, so this thorny question goes to you. Can middle powers really refrain from taking sides in this emerging new Cold War? We've already seen the likes of India, Australia, some parts of the EU gravitating towards the US.
Well, I think they can actually, because we have both because of the situation and because of the nature of the issues that we face today. The world, Asia is not either China-centric or US-led right now. It's between orders and looks like staying that way. The world itself is multipolar economically, but not really in military terms, and politically it's thoroughly confused. So if you look at what's happened in the last 15 years, middle powers are doing much more together than they've ever done before. Just the four countries that are on this panel are cooperating in defense and security, in various fields, which maritime security primarily. And if you look at the issues that we face, these are not issues that either any single power, no matter how powerful, can solve. Issues like cyber, like terrorism, like maritime security. This needs cooperative effort. So what I see happening, and this is my mantra actually, which I think Dewi has heard me say before, is really issue-based coalitions of the willing. And that's where middle powers really have room, because China-US contention opens up space for the middle powers to actually play a role and deal with these issues, which are transnational issues and are beyond the power of any single great power, superpower, whatever, to solve.
That brings us to the point of creative multilateralism, as some call it. Dewi, you've said before that Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia have always been in a dangerous environment. Your own words there. The US, across the Pacific, there's also China, Japan, Russia. Is it different this time round with competition between the US and China?
Well, Southeast Asia has always been, in the middle of big power competitions. The birth of nation states in Southeast Asia were during the Cold War, and throughout, we only enjoyed peace in the immediate post-Cold War period. But now, competition is back again. So this is nothing new. So for Southeast Asian countries and for Indonesia in particular, which has a doctrine of free and active foreign policy, a strategy of non-alignment is part of its DNA foreign policy. And ASEAN as the cornerstone of foreign policy, which always seeks strategic autonomy, trying to engage with all major powers, but not becoming too dependent on any one of them. So this is nothing new for Indonesia or for Southeast Asia. What we have always tried to do is to prevent Southeast Asia from becoming a theater of conflict. So that's why we have to strengthen ASEAN cohesion on the one hand, and then also enhance ASEAN's agency as a regional convener, as you might say, a middle power organization, which tries to bring the different sides together to promote dynamic equilibrium where all major powers are also included in various discussions and issues. So this is actually, the objective of ASEAN and also Indonesia's foreign policy. At the same time, Indonesia, as a middle power, is also very active in engaging in various bilateralism and multilateralism, working together with India, with Australia, with MICTA countries. There's also with Korea here. Can middle power tries to diffuse conflicts? That is the primary role of middle powers. Middle powers come to their own during conflicts. Otherwise, there's not really much space for middle powers. Middle power tries to act as a bridge, to facilitate discussions, to try to mediate. So I do believe that this is actually what we call the middle power moment. And there is people talk about emerging people talk about emerging Cold War. I particularly do not believe that this is a return to this is a Cold War 2.0, because this is not all ideological. This is not a total zero-sum game, because most of those competitions between the US and China actually are sectoral in nature. There's a trade war, there's an on technology issue, there's a vaccine issue. There are many issues, but they tend to be much more functional. So there is actually possibility of reaching agreements in those various sectors, and as been mentioned before, there are a lot of transnational issues which make it possible for countries to work on certain issues together. And whether the question
whether yeah. Apologies there, Ibu Dewi. Ambassador Chan, is this not a Cold War?
Well, Henry Kissinger said we're at the foothills of the Cold War. I think it looks like the Cold War, but it walks like a Cold War. But I think the community of nations don't want it to be a Cold War. No one wants a Cold War. And I think because of that, countries are playing their roles to try to enlarge the middle space. This is where the middle powers step in. I agree with Shivshankar, I agree with Dewi. This is the middle power moment. And you can see it. For instance, this whole idea of the Indo-Pacific strategy. You have, Japan, Australia, India, the United States working together, a bit like the Quad. And ASEAN does not want to sign up for the Indo-Pacific as spelled out as a free and open Indo-Pacific. Indonesia came up with the idea, and ASEAN has proposed an Indo-Pacific strategy that emphasizes ASEAN centrality and inclusiveness. We do not exclude anyone. So here you have, we are a middle power player, and we would like to create more space, create more strategic space. And frankly, through this whole period, 2017 and 2018, we have seen the middle powers come into its own. Japan has been extremely active as a middle power. TPP ended when the United States walked out, but Japan picked it up, and now we have CPTPP. Japan, acted and tried to form strategic partnerships with a lot of countries in the region, maritime cooperation, defense cooperation, and so on. And they came up with the Indo-Pacific strategy. So they're trying to work their space. But I think you are seeing a lot of the middle countries and small countries, particularly at this moment during the time of COVID, trying to stay away from the big power competition, US and China. Everything is so politicized. They are forming, in fact, multilaterals. They are cooperating. For instance, Singapore with 6 countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Chile, Myanmar, and Brunei, wanted to ensure trade lines and sea links open for flow of goods and to maintain the global links. And absent the US leadership, Canada convened a ministerial group of 12 other countries, 13 countries altogether. And this is Brazil, France, Germany, Indonesia, Italy, Morocco, Mexico, Peru, ROK, Singapore, Turkey, United Kingdom. And they want to pool research and scientific resources and share findings. No US, no China. They do not want to politicize science. So I think you are seeing middle powers coming together, forming different kinds of coalition to avoid a binary choice of US and China.
June, the overriding theme we've had so far is that there's greater cooperation among the middle powers. Does it complement or undermine global multilateral institutions? As it stands now, the authority of these multilateral institutions, organizations, are already being challenged.
Well, given the COVID-19 pandemic, I think international institutions have come to a standstill. They've hit a wall with regard to where they can go ahead in terms of multilateral cooperation because first things first, the US and China are at odds about where the virus actually originated from. And the Australian initiative to take this to the WHO has been met with backfiring. And other issues regarding trade at the World Trade Organization, I think that because from the Obama administration, there haven't been proactive hiring appointment of judges on the appellate body, and that has continued on, although there was no significant gesture from the Trump administration to actually depart from it. Ambassador Lighthizer of the USTR is not really keen on WTO reform itself, perhaps maybe just undermining the institution entirely. So I think going forward, what would be really challenging is to bring about efforts at the international institutions that are already in place. And even if there are efforts, there may be different groupings, such as the one that we have at this moment right now, just middle power groups or other standalone groupings based on issues that are really emerging or really, really immediate. So that's a critical concern, and international institutions may not have the power that they used to have before.
Ambassador Chan, what's your take on it?
On the multilateral institutions?
That's right, yes.
Right now, United States is walking away from the multilateral institutions, but I don't think that represents a spectrum of US opinions. China feels that the multilateral institutions really did not reflect their views, and they were not there at the origins and the beginnings. But they haven't pulled out of multilateral institutions, they tried to form it. And I think middle powers should go back. We need to redo the WTO. We need to strengthen WHO. And if we work with these institutions, it can really help the world come to a better place and rules. And frankly, I think there needs to be some thought given to the new digital economy and cyberspace and so on. And you really need multilateral institutions to come up with those kinds of rules.
Shiv, I want to take a look at India's relations with China. You were India's ambassador to China, and you say that China's behavior has been very different from anything we've seen in the past. With China now becoming an Indian Ocean maritime power, as you suggested as well, how should India respond to this?
Well, I think India-China relations today are in crisis because of what happened over the spring on the border. That could work either way. It could represent an opportunity to create a new strategic framework for the relationship by the two sides, or it could go the other way. More likely, I think we'll choose the third option, which is sort of muddling through. Winter setting in, which makes clashes unlikely, but for the time being. But we're now in this frozen sort of confrontation on the border. And so that, I think, has prompted a lot of people in India to look for other alternatives to the traditional Indian strategy, which is a balancing strategy, which is non-alignment, which is strategic autonomy, but which is also not being too close to any of the great powers, or at least not ceding the power of decision in these relationships, and therefore trying, say, between China and the US to have good relations with both. I think that is no longer an option. So naturally, people look at other balancing strategies. They look to the US, they look to other powers in the region, to other countries, Japan, Singapore, Korea, Indonesia, friends in the region, to work together and to see whether we can't actually create an inclusive, open, plural Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific for all of us to actually prosper in. Now, the trouble is that we have an India-China crisis at the same time as well. The world has this trifecta of an economic crash, pandemic, etc., and no leadership. So no multilateral organizations actually working or effectively. So in that situation, it seems to me it's an opportunity for us to recast the way we do our business, to actually concentrate on the things that are important. And the only people who can really do this are the middle powers. The trouble is, of course, that all the institutions we use, multilateral institutions, are only as good as the member states are. As if the member states are divided, if they're disunited, and if the great powers especially are disunited, then the institutions themselves are ineffective. So I think we need to look for new ways of doing business. And India will turn more, yes, certainly to the US, because they have a shared understanding, I think, of how China is going about her business. But I think beyond that, India will also look for other arrangements, for other balancing arrangements with other countries. Now, India has basic choices to make, and let's see which ones she does. Because like China, India too, as a result of the pandemic and the economic crash, is talking of self-sufficiency. But how much autarky does that really involve? And I don't see how an Indian economy where almost half the GDP is the external sector can ever go back to import substitution and so on. So, but India has to choose then to actually participate in reworking the global trading and economic system, and that's going to pose some difficult choices. We really are at a crossroads. I know it's a cliche, but we really are today. And let's see where India goes on this.
Very quickly, though, Shiv, before I speak to Ibu Dewi, what happened to the close relationship between Xi Jinping and Modi?
Well, I think it's dangerous to personalize relations between big countries, because the more you personalize, the more you lose strategy. And I think there's no question, even today, at the leadership level, there have been consistent efforts to try and work through the crisis, to try and at least make sure that it doesn't get worse, and to try and dial it down, to keep the temperature low. If you look at statements at the leadership level, they've been very restrained on both sides. That continues, but the problems are more structural, I think, especially on issues like the border or the trade imbalances which exist. Almost half of India's trade deficit is because of trade with China, and the other frictions that have arisen in the recent past. But for me, those are issues which, if we do work out a new strategic framework, after all, we did manage to work one out before and keep the peace and develop the relationship over the last 3-4 decades, despite having a boundary dispute. And I don't see why we can't do that again, but it's going to take some adjustment by both sides.
Right. Ibu Dewi, Indonesia, the biggest country in Southeast Asia, 250 million people. How are these geopolitical concerns shaping Indonesia's own defense and foreign policy? How does it view its strategic outlook?
Well, Indonesia's strategic outlook has been more or less quite constant, trying to ensure that the Southeast Asian region in particular remains autonomous, that, it is not dominated by external powers, and that close cooperation between all of the countries, and also now increasingly with ASEAN becoming more confident, engaging all of those countries. So there has been a change in that sense. When I say there's constant strategic autonomy, in the old days, there was this desire to keep all countries out, all major powers out, kind of leave us alone kind of attitude, and leave us alone to do our internal development. But now it's also a more outward-looking strategy of trying to engage all countries. That's why the creation of various ASEAN regional mechanisms which engage external powers. In terms of its defense policy, it's not really driven by security dilemma. It's more driven by budget constraints. So at the moment, Indonesia has tried to improve its military capability, develop minimal essential force, that's been throughout the past 15 years. But as I said, it's not driven by concerns of traditional threats so much. You can see that there's a lot of concerns more about non-traditional security threats. So in terms of engaging all sides, at the moment, Indonesia has very close relations with China, probably the best relations ever, because of President Jokowi's focus on infrastructure development. So Indonesia is a participant of the BRI. It is a member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's very open to Chinese investment. But at the same time, there are also problems on the South China Sea issue. Indonesia is not a party to the conflict in the South China Sea, but we have problems with China's nine-dash line, which Indonesia, of course, does not recognize because this is not recognized in the 1982 Law of the Sea. So, in fact, Indonesia has renamed its sea the exclusive economic zones around the Natuna as North Natuna Sea to enforce its national claim. And domestically, suspicions of China remain very high. So there are this very complicated issue with China for Indonesia. It is not just a foreign policy issue. It is also very much complicated with domestic issues. And we always have to be very careful, that anti-China sentiment does not also become anti-Chinese sentiment in Indonesia. That also, something that Indonesia always has to be very careful about. At the same time, in terms of ensuring this strategic autonomy, not becoming too dependent on other countries, while trying to engage with China, trying to bring in China's money to support Indonesia's infrastructure development. It also actively tries to engage with Japan. In a couple of days, the new Prime Minister of Japan is making his first state visit to ASEAN countries, and that is to Indonesia. And also, despite the difficulties that Trump is not a favorite character in Indonesia, particularly because Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim nation, and that also a very strong support of the Palestinian independence. So there is a lot of opposition to the current leadership in the US, but at the same time, the relations with the US also remains close, in terms of security cooperation, also including in fact. So for Indonesia, this is, as I said, this is our default drive. Indonesia thrives in the kind of this global power competition. Actually, it sees opportunities when there are. It is much more concerning when major powers are too much in concert and squeeze the middle powers out. So when there are a bit of rivalry, it is actually an opportunity for Indonesia and other ASEAN countries and other middle powers, to find space and also to actually get more deals, better deals with China muzzling in Indonesia that actually creates greater interest from Japan, for example, to improve its terms of loan and so on. So in this case, I said, Indonesia has continued to emphasize its independent foreign policy.
Speaking of Japan, June, U.S.-China tensions coming at a time of changing power relationships between Korea and Japan. Both see their economic and national interests somewhat converge. Could this be the right time, an opportune time for deeper cooperation between the two, or is the mistrust and the issue of history still too great for the two?
On this issue, I am very much realistic about the future paths because a couple of days ago, the new Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga indicated that he would not attend the trilateral summit as long as there is no mechanism set in place in South Korea with regard to putting a stall systematically to the caching of wartime forced labor related assets to be seized based on the Supreme Court's ruling in South Korea a few years ago. And there's been, the ruling had unleashed a trade conflict between the two countries on semiconductor parts, ingredients to semiconductors. And the conflict, 1 year on, this trade mechanism on high tech, it's expanded into areas that we have not really fathomed, especially pertaining to Huawei and other, because the semiconductor industry is essentially what's going to drive the next generation of future industries, not just on network infrastructure, but also artificial intelligence. So I think the history issue is what it looks like on the outside, and it's very, very deep. At the same time, the tech war is probably what is the most immediate concern between the two countries. And this kind of friction, the bilateral friction between Japan and South Korea, does not help Washington at all with regard to Washington's efforts to group the countries together into more of a collaborative scheme, be it on military terms or on economic terms.
So it's going to be very difficult for them to advance middle power cooperation, you think?
Exactly. Because the history issue from the Japanese side on the assets freezing of wartime companies, Japanese companies, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, the LDP, the ruling party, there's a very, very stark bottom line on this, which is that they are not going to negotiate on this issue. And, it's not just within the region that you witness this. In Germany, in Berlin, there has been an ongoing dispute about, the Japanese government's demands to remove the statue, the Comfort Woman statue, and the Berlin city has had to sort of succumb to Japanese demands, and then with the public opinion backlash, they would just indicate that they would work out a solution by not immediately removing it. And it remains to be seen what kinds of responses throughout the world there may be on Japan's history issues. This is just the beginning. And as long as the leadership here does not change, there's a presidential election in 2022. But on the Japan side, prime ministers come and go. It's not for sure how long these leaders will be in place and how the leaderships would change. These are democracies. But as long as the two lines are going in parallel, this is going to be very difficult.
Ambassador John, we heard from Shiv earlier about how China's behavior is unlike the past. The thing is, U.S. behavior is also unlike the past. How does a small nation like Singapore balance its relations with the U.S., which is a strategic ally, and China, which is a top trading partner? When you take a look at what Singapore hopes out of the U.S. and China, how does that look like?
How do we balance a relationship? People ask me that all the time, and I say with difficulty. It's not that easy. But I think Singapore has always behaved in a consistent way. We are open and we are frank. If we can do something, we'll say yes. If we can't do something, we'll say no, whether it is to the United States or to China. And we have sometimes, by our actions, offended the United States. We have also offended China. And I think over time, other countries look at Singapore and realize we are acting in our own interest. We have many equities, strong equities with the United States. Similarly, as you say, with China, So I think that's the way we move our relationship. And we hope this is a path we can keep, although it is getting increasingly difficult. But let me put it this way, Haslinda. Everybody says, who do you choose? How do you choose? My own thinking about choice is that all countries do not want a binary choice, but nobody actually says, I choose the US or I choose China. End of story. The choice is final. Actually, choice is really taking a series of small choices. For instance, if the United States puts an initiative on the table, TPP, some countries sign up for it, some countries don't. Then they put the free and open Indo-Pacific on the table. Some countries sign up for it, none of the ASEAN countries did. The Chinese put BRI on the table, countries sign for it, some countries don't. Japan and Australia, is not very supportive, nor of AIIB. So you have BRI, AIIB, RCEP. So countries sign up for individual initiatives. They do not just meet at a grand meeting and say, I'm on this side or that side. So I think over time, the choices add up. But most countries would like to be able to choose from both sides. So that is how Singapore also sees its path forward. That it's not really just binary choice. And we are actively engaging other countries. We talk all the time about small states having agency. We believe in that. We are quite active with minilaterals. And I think you create new groupings, overlapping groupings. And that, I think, strengthens the fabric and it doesn't sort of tear things apart.
You talk about how ASEAN countries are working together. Do you see COVID-19 as an opportunity to bring ASEAN closer together? Has it brought the region closer together?
Well, the hope is that we will. I think during the COVID period, ASEAN countries have tried, those who can, to help each other, sending, test kits, vaccines, equipment, ventilators, and so on. And I know Singapore does quite a bit sending to Myanmar. And we have received from others too. So I think we sent some to Indonesia. But we are just helping each other. But everyone is so caught up with their own internal problems. But what is important is that ASEAN countries are trying to open up to each other. We understand that for the region, for our countries, for the region to recover, we have to open up. So Malaysia and Singapore is looking at opening up. Indonesia and Singapore is looking at opening up. And Singapore is in talks with Thailand to open up also. Of course, Singapore is very active in this, and we have to be. We are a small country, a micro-state, a tiny state, and we have no resources, no hinterland. We survive on connectivity. So we have to keep the connections open. So we are active and other countries are open to it. So if ASEAN countries start opening to each other, Vietnam as well, I think we will bring ASEAN together, closer together. And these travel bubbles will start forming groupings. By the way, there are other travel bubbles opening up also. But in the Asian region, East Asian region, these bubbles may become some kind of grouping. And, you have permutations there. And if you deal with each other, there are lots of visits and exchanges, well, you have a new space to work with.
Shiv, we know that India is engaging with Southeast Asia. Does rising Hindu nationalism under the BJP government impact its potential ties with the region? How do you view that, especially when it's dealing with Muslim majority countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia?
Well, I'm not sure that today it's a major fact. Today there are other bigger issues in these relationships than concerns about the internal course that one or the other might be following. I think there's much bigger issues in dealing with the pandemic. For one, is getting an economic recovery going, getting the economic relationship up and running, creating what Chee was just talking about, creating safe spaces, bubbles within which people can start traveling, we can restore connectivity. I think those things take priority. So I'm not sure that worry about the internal direction that any other country is taking right now is going to take priority, or should actually, because there are much more basic issues of survival at stake here, of survival, of jobs, of livelihoods. So I'm not sure that that actually is a big factor. But for India, I think connectivity with Southeast Asia has become critical. You know, when India started reform, only about 15% of GDP was the external sector. By 2014, it was 49.6%. That's almost half of GDP. You add remittances and so on, and the rest of the world has become much more important. And in the rest of the world, Southeast Asia has actually grown much, much more important to India. So for me, that's the driver of the relationship. When you talk of an Indo-Pacific strategy, you can't have an Indo-Pacific strategy with a big hole in the middle without ASEAN involved, without Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, other countries in Southeast Asia involved in producing the public goods that today, unfortunately, the world order is no longer producing, whether it's, safety of the sea lanes. We've worked together against piracy and worked very successfully in the past. There's a whole host of things that we can be doing and should be doing. And right now, I think the priority has to be the economy and getting past the pandemic together, which, again, as I said, is not something we can do alone, any of us.
In terms of India's influence in Southeast Asia, India's left RCEP. Does it make India less influential among Southeast Asian countries?
I think these relationships are based on mutual interest rather than on influence or so for me, as long as there's this huge congruence of interest, this coincidence of interest, that's what's going to drive the relationship forward, more than what you might think about somebody's beliefs or behavior.
June, I want to talk about Korea's engagement with Southeast Asia in its southern policy, which was established about 3 years ago. 3 years on, how much has been achieved? Have ASEAN nations responded the way Korea had envisioned?
It's still an ongoing process, and I think the cultural aspect of K-culture influence into the region has been more salient than in other areas. As a political economist, I would like to point out that the competition that South Korea faces in Southeast Asia is pretty much severe because other countries like Japan and China have had first mover advantage, Japan especially, for the longest time. And breaking ground in Southeast Asia requires that kind of maneuvering within the region. And also Australia, the presence of other countries that are already there make it a tougher competition. But culturally, I think it's been very, very successful. And especially with the dissemination and impact of K-culture in there, it's been widely received. I think that in terms of military cooperation, South Korea has not been very much responsive to the U.S. request to join the Quad, and I don't think it actually will under this administration. And if there is an initiative to sort of formulate something akin to the NATO in the European region, chances are the kind of lack of connectivity may sort of hinder South Korea's overall participation in such kind of grouping. But one-to-one in terms of South Korea-ASEAN related cooperation, I think it's going pretty well. And there's been a lot of scholastic / policy exchanges over the past 3 years under this administration. That's been a remarkable progress.
Dewi, what's your take on Korea's southern policy? Has it been a two-way engagement? Has there been reciprocity, and how do you build on it?
Well, I think we look at it at the regional level and at the bilateral level. If you look at the bilateral level, as June said, South Korea actually has had a very in-depth and extensive relations in Indonesia. If you look at the until recently, until a lot of Chinese workers come to Indonesia, the largest expat workers in Indonesia are Koreans. A lot of the manufacturing industries in Indonesia are Korean-owned. And Indonesians also work in Korean companies under the so-called trainee program. So at the bilateral level, it's a quite extensive relations. And in fact, in terms of military cooperation, Indonesia and Korea are working together to build fighter planes and also to build warships. I think at the regional level, ASEAN-Korean relations have developed from sectoral relations to full dialogue partnership. What we have tried to do, in terms of the Korean Peninsula issue, ASEAN has been the primary regional convener, and there is ASEAN Regional Forum, and there is East Asia Forum, so on and so forth. But in terms of the discussions on the Korean Peninsula, ASEAN has been excluded. There's also been my complaints for a long time. Why not also include ASEAN in the discussions? So I would argue that ASEAN and Korea have worked together, and it has responded to the Korean Southern policy. And at the bilateral level, I think Korea is also very well received. And also in terms of middle power, Indonesia, Korea, and Australia are part of MICTA. That's this middle powers grouping within the G20 that comprise of Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, and Australia. And that's although it's not working very well at the moment, because the focus is also on democratic cooperation, and there's been some democratic regression in a number of countries. So MICTA has not been as successful in that aspect. But Korea and Indonesia continue to drive this. So the southern policies, I think, it has to be looked at the bilateral level, also at the regional level, but also at the multilateral level, minilateralism. And I would argue that Korean pop culture is very popular in Indonesia also.
Shiv, we heard June talk about the Quad. We're hot on the heels of the Quad meeting involving India, Australia, Japan, the US. Have relations among the Quad members changed fundamentally over the last 8 months or so, given that India, Australia, the US do have issues with China?
Yes, but they also have big stakes in their relationships with China. I mean, China is still, for India, the biggest trading partner in goods. And despite the crisis, if you look at April to September this year, India-China trade figures are up. They've actually risen. And China is India's biggest neighbor on land. And there's no question, as you said, China is a presence in the Indian Ocean, just as the Indian Navy now operates beyond Malacca as well. So actually, India and China rub up against each other in so many ways that, it's, as I think Chee was saying, we need to look at this as a process, at politics in the region. It's not a question of choosing one side or the other, or of decoupling from each other. I don't think that's quite how it's going to work. Where does the Quad figure in this? The Quad is useful because each of us has very strong bilateral relationships, to the extent that we can actually work together, as we are now about to do in say, naval exercises. To that extent, it's a useful addition. But ultimately, it's only a forum which is as good as its members want to make it. We tried the Quad earlier in 2007, and it then withered away in 2008, precisely because, as you said, some members were more worried about their relationship with China at that stage. Today, we're in a slightly different situation. And I think the Quad is really an organization in search of a role. And if it is to have a real future, it will have to find functional cooperation avenues where other people also work with it. Just the four alone are not going to be able to do it. It's a dialogue forum. Yes, it's useful to exchange opinions, information, but that's only a dialogue forum. So far, that's what it is, a quadrilateral security dialogue. Taking it beyond that will require the participation, working with others, and an expansion at least, and an identification of very clear functional areas where it has potential. So I'm rather surprised actually by the vehemence of the Chinese reaction against something that is still quite amorphous and could evolve in various ways.
With India already cooperating with Australia with the Quad arrangement, is it conceivable that India would invite Australia to join the Malabar naval exercise with the US and Japan?
Well, it looks almost certain now. It seems that I think it's probably going to happen in the next round.
Do you think India wants to step up its strategic interest in the Indo-Pacific? Is there reason to think India would be heading that way?
India is in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, it's just the name itself tells you that India's there. And Indian interests in maritime security, which is basically what the Indo-Pacific is about. It's a maritime concept. Have been growing steadily over the years and will continue to grow. This is where the future is. But then India is also a continental power. And neither the Quad nor the idea of the Indo-Pacific actually address those issues, as we saw this spring on the border with China. So India is the only one actually of the Quad members which is both a maritime and a continental power, and which therefore has to deal not just with China, but with the change situation across the board in multiple dimensions. So India, in that sense, in the Quad, does have interests beyond the Indo-Pacific and beyond. For India, we like to look at our interests, our security at least, in terms of concentric circles. I mean, it's not just the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region, but what happens in West Asia, what happens in Southeast Asia, what happens in Northeast Asia, all of them in Central Asia, they all affect us almost directly. So given our location, I think looking just at the Indo-Pacific from an Indian point of view doesn't actually solve our dilemmas, our problems.
I'd like to pose this question to all the speakers. Of course, we are counting down to the US election with 20 days or so left. Will a Biden presidency dial down tensions with China, even though he himself has said that China is the biggest security threat for the world? Perhaps we can start with Ambassador Chan.
Well, the U.S. relationship with China, in fact, there is now a bipartisan consensus on how the United States should deal with China. And, the American polity believes that they should be tougher with China. They should be firmer with China. And they should try to work out the trade deficits and, some of the issues in the technology sector, etc. I think the difference between a Biden administration, if Joe Biden is elected, and that of the present Trump administration would be really a change in tenor. There would be, I think, more predictability in the approach to China, and there would be a framework. Right now, I think in the Trump administration, the way policies are formed, sometimes it just comes as a bit of a surprise. The tone is a bit of a surprise. And so there would be greater predictability. And countries like predictability. And I guess the Asian region would like to see some predictability. And that helps. But I think in the general trend, towards dealing with China, whether it's a Biden presidency or a Trump second presidency, the United States will be tough with China. I think Biden's team, if they should come in, would like to confront China, but also work with China. They want to work with China on issues of non-proliferation, the pandemic, climate change particularly. And for the Democrats, climate change is a big issue. So there are areas of cooperation and areas where they would stand up and really deal with China and confront China there. Now, this is not so very different. Actually, under President Obama, and I do remember, because I was still in the United States, when I spoke to the officials in the White House and in State Department, they always said when they went to ARF meetings, EAS meetings, they would be tough with China on some issues, particularly the South China Sea. But they always were concerned to roll out a roster of agenda items that they would work with China on. So, there was cooperation, but there was also, an attempt to check and confront China on issues that they wanted to solve. And so this was how the Democrats approached the relationship with China. I think in the case of President Trump, you will see more of what he has done in the first term, and I think countries in the region are concerned, although there is another school that feels that because President Trump is transactional and he wants to seal a deal, that there could be surprises. And you could see surprises in the second term. They would still be tough, but who knows? Never count anything out. Everything is possible in politics.
Ambassador Chan, thank you for that. We are running out of time very quickly. I just want to pose this polling question to you for our speakers. How do you think the COVID-19 crisis will reshape the global order? 1, revival of the nation state with every country for itself. 2, greater global cooperation with stronger multilateral institutions. 3, stronger regional groupings built around middle powers. And 4, nothing will change. Perhaps I can call on Shiv. What's your take on it?
I think it actually accelerates existing trends, and therefore I think it's more, number one, the strengthening of the nation state and the fragmentation of the global order, whether it's economic or political, rather than the other three options.
June?
I agree.
Ibu Dewi?
Well, then I think I'll be different. I think that it will be changes, but it will be nothing structurally really going to change very much, because nationalism, for new countries, nation states has always been very strong. But we also want to work with multilateral systems, and we also want to strengthen cooperation. So I'll pour.
Prof. Chan, you have the last word.
Well, I belong to the school that believes that there will not be a great transformation post-COVID, because we should not underestimate, that people, human beings, really revert to the status quo. There's a great resistance to change. So in individual societies, I do not see that much change. But in the global order, internationally, I would say the first three positions that was listed in the survey, all the three will happen. Countries will turn inward, they will be nationalistic, and, Modi has said that, I think Prime Minister Modi in May also said that India will now, look more inward in some form of words. Japan has emphasized self-autonomy. Every country will want some self-sufficiency. But I think it is also true that new regional groupings will come about, middle powers will try to come together. We've been talking about the multilaterals and the new regional groupings. So I think you will see a lot of movement and action in the international arena. Also, there will be attempts, great concern to strengthen WHO, because I think everybody now sees health as an important, a very important element in the life of nations and in our personal lives. And also, I think the WTO needs fixing, and I'm hoping that G20 would somehow take it up and start thinking through what does a new WTO look like.
And on that note, I'd like to wrap up our discussion today. Thank you to Dr. June Park, Ambassador Heng, Chee, Dewi, Fortuna, Anwar, and Shivshankar Menon. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. Have a good day ahead.